Shabbat Shalom.
So in Parashat Noach, I say thank God that it appears, I don't want to say ever too old to learn something new because, at least the age of 63, almost 64, not done learning. Because I mentioned on Sukkot the idea that there are 70 nations, right? And there are, according to the rabbi, 70 nations or 70 languages. For them, pretty much the same thing. And there are 70 sacrifices offered during Sukkot. So they concluded that during Sukkot, Israel offers one sacrifice for the well-being of each other nation. I learned that comes after this week's Parashat. You count up all of the descendants of Noah named in the Parsha, it comes to 7, right? And each one is presumed to be the ancestor of a nation. But more significantly, in this Parsha, we have, and again, it's a rabbinic extrapolation. It's not, specifically word for word in Parsha. The idea of Sheva Mitzvot B'nei, the 7 commandments of the descendants of Noah, and this is according to classic Jewish thought, what every non-Jewish person needs to observe in order to be considered righteous and have a share in the world to come, although there is some debate exactly what is the conditions of that obedience. In other words, Maimonides says it's not enough for you to observe them because you think it's a good idea, it makes sense, humanity would be better off to live this way. You have to observe them as if it's, in other words, I observe them because God said, not I observe them because it's a good idea. But they are extrapolated from this week's Parsha. So here is what they are. The prohibition of idolatry, the prohibition of murder or bloodshed, the Hebrew kudami, which means spilling of blood, or spilling of, with consequences, the prohibition of theft, the prohibition of sexual immorality, the prohibition of blasphemy, the prohibition of eating flesh taken from an animal while it is still alive, ever min ha'chai, and the requirement of maintaining courts to provide legal recourse. Now that ever min ha'chai is worth noting for a minute as we towards the commercial viability of life. Okay, because how is lab grown meat, right? Take a cell and it has in it the DNA, which is the instructions for replication, and then you culture that in a lab. Okay, and among the questions, is this kosher, is it tasted, whatever? And there is some concern that if the cell which is used to propagate that cell line is taken from a live animal, then that is a violation of ever min ha'chai, and therefore that product would be trained. Now the chicken that is out, that some an Israeli company is ready to market, but it's not. I mean, it's like it's a mortgage payment to buy it right now. But the cell line is from an egg, okay, not from a chicken per se, which avoids ever min ha'chai. It also means, in my eyes, that it should be taught, right? Eggs are taught. that's just theoretical, right? But why the prohibition of murder, right? Because every human being is created with Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. I read this morning that a convoy of aid has gotten across the border from Egypt to Gaza. And as Jews, this should make us happy, right? Because all human beings are created with Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And, it is natural and good and right that we have more concern for our own than for others, right? That's natural. Like I put Jeff on the spot last week, right? And like, why does any parent provide for their own kids when there are hundreds and thousands of hungry kids in Montgomery County, right? And why does the right for the county provide throughout the world, right? But it's concentric circles, and it's normal that we should have more concern for our own. But right, because Hillel always comes through, right? Ain ani li, right? If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But right? If I'm only for myself, what after? Right? So the idea of Tselem Elohim is key for how we should relate to others. But I think at the same time, it is possible for people to behave in such a way, they're still created in the image of God, but they almost cancel that out willingly, right? And I saw an interview yesterday, and I mentioned before the Torah reading that, how small a community we are, and the sociological rules that any two Jews in the world know and learn, right? And so the NBC reporter Mark Fletcher, right, may be familiar to you. He reported from Israel for years and years, had a British accent, right? And he actually is a British Jew who made Aliyah. He lives in Israel, and has been managed to be journalistic about activity, covered Israel for many years for BBC. Turns out that the two American hostages who were released yesterday are relatives of his wife, right? So from being a journalistic story, it becomes a personal story. But what surprised me about what he said in this interview is because Hamas portrays itself as an Islamic group, he assumed that they would treat the hostages well, right? And he found out that that wasn't so. Right now, the thing is, does Islam teach a basic, rule of morality? It does. Does that mean that every person who calls himself a Muslim follows it? No, right? In the same way that not every person who calls themselves a Jew follows Jewish morality. Not every person who calls themselves a Christian follows Christian morality, right? So you can't understand, you can't assume that the label tells you how they're going to be, right? But it also, and this is very clear, this is not a war between Judah it's not a war between the Jews and the Muslims. It's a war between Israel and Hamas. Right? And look, there are Muslims serving in the IDF. Right? So it's clear that choosing Hamas, but there are Muslims. There have been Muslims killed in this war, both Muslim soldiers as well as I have heard the story of a Muslim ambulance driver who went to evacuate people at that music festival and was himself killed, right? So this is not a war between Judaism and Islam. But at the same time, one of the more disturbing things that I saw this week, maybe where there was a demonstration in the Cannon House office, right? There are about 300 people, most of them Jews, were arrested calling for a ceasefire, right? And the thing is, I recognize some of these people, and I recognize some of these people. One of them I was actually arrested after civil disobedience, right? But look, find a banner that says free the hostages now and ceasefire, right? There's an ability, I think, just like Martin Fletcher was not stupid, assume that hostages will be treated well because that somehow a ceasefire is going to stop the problem. Ceasefire is not going to solve the problem. Frankly, releasing the hostages alone is not going to solve the problem either if it leaves Hamas in power. But there's an inability, right? I mean, so people started looking, because the organization that organized this at Cannon is called Jewish Voice for Peace. Okay? Don't assume that just because that's its name, right? But an inability, like when they put out their statement, they said, they're saddened or grieved by the bloodshed. They couldn't bring themselves to say, we condemn what Hamas. We're saddened by what Hamas. Right? But they couldn't bring themselves to condemn what Hamas did. And there was an article at the time, I think it was by Ross Townsend, the problems with liberal education. Right? Now, a big, right, but a liberal education should teach you critical thinking skills, right? And the ability to say that certain things are simply wrong. Murdering civilians intentionally is wrong. Right? Killing civilians as collateral damage is something that should be regretted and something that the military has the absolute obligation to minimize, but it probably can't be eliminated entirely in the conditions of contemporary warfare, particularly when you're fighting an enemy that purposely embeds itself in the midst of a civilian population. But I wonder, it didn't surprise me, because one of the most shocking things I've ever heard was something that I heard in the spring of 2002. Okay, so a few months after 9/11, and I'm working at this research institute in Baltimore, Interfaith Research Institute. My Catholic colleague and I are invited by a professor. to give a guest lecture to his class. And we did. And in the Q&A afterwards, a young woman raised her hand and she said, who am I to say what the hijacker did was wrong? Okay? Who am I to say that what they did was wrong? And now, would I personally hijack an airplane and fly it into a building? I wouldn't. But the people who did this thought they were doing a good thing. So who am I to say that they were wrong? Okay, and if you can't say that the 9/11 hijackers were wrong, here you have a 4.0 G. There is something wrong with you, right? There is something wrong with you. And if you can't say that what happened on October 7th is wrong, and all you can say is that it saddens you, there's something wrong, right? And you don't understand. You can wrap yourself in a tallis, as many of these people did, but you don't understand. It's nice that you understand that Arabs and Muslims are created with Tselem Elohim. Jews are also created by Tselem Elohim, right? And that Hamas, right? The world was filled with Hamas, with rage and anger, right? And those who suffer from this are frankly not only Jews. The people of Gaza suffer from this as well, right? And why doesn't Israel allow more aid in? Well, we will. Israel says we will release the hostages, right? So why isn't Israel's? Why isn't Hamas's? Right? And there is a certain basic inability that some people have of saying there are absolute standards, and I might understand why somebody violates them, but it doesn't mean the standard doesn't exist, right? Just like it may interest you to know, the speed limit on Apple Ridge Road is 25 miles an hour. That's the standard, right? The fact that I literally had a congregate telling me that I should talk to the police department that they shouldn't put up that radar thing that they put up because they got too many tickets. And I said, if you don't want to get a ticket on Apple Ridge Road, right? But there are certain standards that objectively exist. Somebody in the hospital, you might have a legitimate reason to speak, right? But because you overslept by 5 minutes, that's the point. The point is, if you cannot bring yourself to say this was wrong, and the people who did this can no longer remain in power, there's something wrong. And I'm not sure exactly, like I, and it was big because certain large law firms would do this with job offers to third-year law students who had signed certain statements, right? And I read an interview with the hiring department and said, look, to be a lawyer requires critical thinking, right? And if say that the 1,400 Israelis who were killed, that's Israel's fault, you lack the ability to engage in critical thinking, and we don't want you as an associate in our group, right? And on the liberal education that I got, maybe because it was at a Catholic school, right, also taught us critical thinking and that there are objective standards of right and wrong that have to be followed, and that traces back to this week's Parashat. Shabbat Shalom. Honest before Musaf and the Musaf service, page 155 or 428, we'll say Musaf together.